Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all virtually, and I'm very sorry not to be in there in person to benefit from the lively discussions that have no doubt gone on. Now, I've been asked to task with offering some ethical legal reflections on personalised medicine. I think we can have an entire conference on these issues. But for the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to focus on one or two challenges and then offer some reflections on how we may think about addressing some of these issues. So as you all know, key to personalised medicine is the collection, use, and storage of biological samples, clinical information, genetic data, as well as other types of personal data. Increasingly, we're also seeing that involves the use of AI. Now, this use of data, samples, and AI for research and delivery of care raises distinct ethical, legal, and social concerns. And I think at the outset, I would like to echo something that Orla said about the medicalization of a human. Here we need to remember that we are dealing with human samples and human data. Now, an ongoing challenge that we've had for quite some time is how to govern access to the data while also safeguarding the rights and interests of patients. Now, from a privacy and a data protection perspective, we do have the GDPR and the health research regulations in Ireland. And they somehow try to attempt to balance between the right to data protection with the public interest in science. Now, in May of this year, the European Commission proposed the draft European Health Data Space. And if that's enacted in its current form, it will shift the space somewhat. It's going to create an obligation to share electronic health data for certain secondary purposes. And this includes personalised medicine if certain criteria are met. Now, I think for many researchers in particular, when I talk about this area, this draft regulation, they're quite excited and very much welcoming it. But in its current format, there are fundamental problems with this draft from a social and ethical perspective. Now, I'm going to focus in and comment on the European Health Data Space, but these comments also allow us to think more broadly about these challenges in the context of personalised medicine. Now, one of the first things that you will notice for those of you who have read the European Health Data Space regulation is that it's removing consent as a legal requirement to process electronic health data. And it does this on the basis that, and I'm quoting here, it is replacing it with the trusted governance and at a lower cost than relying on consent. So it's using an economic justification to erode one of the pillars of the ethical conduct of research, that is informed consent, which flows from our right to autonomy. It is contrary to the Citizens' Jury report that has favoured an opt-in approach to consent. Now, I absolutely acknowledge that consent is challenging, but that's because we're relying very much on the old way of doing consent that may not necessarily be fit for the data sharing worlds that we are now in. So I would argue that we need to rethink consent, but not get rid of it. A second point I'd like to make is that the European Health Data Space is contrary to a lot of empirical work on access to health data. It states that data subjects no longer will have to be informed when their data is accessed for the multiple secondary uses. Now, in March of this year, I ran a study where we surveyed 1,000 members of the Irish public on their perspectives on the sharing of their genomic and health data. And we just focused in on research. Now, many of the results echoed that of the citizen jury. But what came very, very clear from our study is that participants want to be informed about what their data is being used for. They want to be informed about who is using it, and they want to know what is the benefit. So our job is to create a system and a governance framework that respects this right and the desire to be informed. The third, an assumption that I see a lot in the data sharing sphere is that privacy is the only concern. The GDPR and the European Health Data Space do propose a governance structure, but the safeguards focus on privacy and data protection. And there is often this inherent assumption that if we guard against re-identifiability, then it's okay. But we know that's not correct. We know that there are multiple examples of data and samples use that can lead to discrimination and stigmatization. So our governance structure needs to guard against more than just privacy and re-identifiability, but account for all of these other concerns and issues that may arise. Another point I'd like to make is that the European Health Data Space talks about, and again I'm going to quote, unleashing the benefits of the secondary use of electronic health data. But these benefits, and in particular, the equity of benefit, are assumed. Now, we had a great data sharing experiment with COVID-19. And one of the reasons why the vaccines were developed so quickly is because we had data sharing. So that we saw that if we share data and knowledge quickly, we can get a vaccine. And so we did get the benefit, we got the vaccine, but we did not have equity of benefit. Once we got the benefit, the vaccine, national and commercial interests took over, which resulted in a global inequity of benefit. Now, if we are to encourage the Irish public to share their data, we need to ensure that we embed equity of benefit in the governance process. It's pointless asking us to share our data if there's not going to be resulting access. Now, these and many other issues I don't have time to go into become much more complex when AI enters the mix. Now, our AI can only be ever as good as the data that feeds it. But we know that our data sets are biased, as they're primarily coming from Western populations. We have an increasingly diverse population in Ireland, but if our data sets do not reflect that diversity, the benefit will only be for a select group within the population. Now, this is, of course, something that Ireland alone cannot resolve, but Ireland must support and push for the global efforts that are ongoing to rectify this lack of diversity. A global response will lead to a national benefit. But in country, with the data that we've collected in country, there may be other biases in our data due to destruction and other forms of inequality and discrimination. So the question we now have to think about is, how do we account for these biases to ensure that the resulting AI is not biased? Now, all of these conversations are incredibly timely as we are at a unique juncture. The Health Information Bill is progressing. Ireland is going to have to introduce a system of electronic health records, and the research is progressing. So we're going to have to introduce technical change and change governance at a time when we want to start scaling up research into and the implementation of personalised medicine. But to do this right, it is critical that we are bold in our thinking. And the starting point cannot be how we do it now, but how we want it done. We must think outside of the Irish box, but also beyond just what our partners across the Irish Sea are doing. And I want to focus on 2 points before I conclude. The first is consent and rethinking the form of consent that we want to embed in a new governance and technical solution. Individuals have preference on their data use, and they must be respected if we want to have a social license. But the current consent model, I think we can agree, is of course burdensome. So I'd ask you all now to realistically consider the integration of dynamic consent into the Irish health and research infrastructure. Here in Italy, I work supporting a biobank in South Tyrol, and we have adopted dynamic consent as the consent model since its inception in 2011. So we have over 10 years of practical experience of using dynamic consent. And our experience has refuted many of the theoretical criticisms or concerns with dynamic consent. Our dynamic consent model allows us to inform participants about the use of their data. They can opt out of certain studies if they want, and reconsent if the research is going beyond their original consent. And this system actually also allowed us to contact participants to invite them to be involved in a COVID study. And this was important as it was involving participants who were not admitted to hospital at a time when Italy was in lockdown and recruitment otherwise would have been impossible. So it was very much an unforeseen benefit of dynamic consent. And of course, dynamic consent is just one part of the governance structure. We have it guided by an access policy, which I've just finished revising. We have a data access committee, and we have various SOPs. But it is a participant-centric approach that enables the use of samples and data for research. And this is what must be at the core of what we are doing. It must be patient-centric throughout, from how we manage the samples and data to the research itself and ultimate implementation. Now, to achieve this, there's going to be a need for sustained and ongoing engagement on these matters with the Irish public. And this applies both to the development of the legislation and policy in the area, but also the individual research projects itself. Now, the proposed National Health Information Garden could have this as one of its functions. But as to the engagement as part of the research itself, I think we really can learn from our African colleagues, where there is a culture of community engagement there as part of research. During my postdoc, I was very much fortunate to be part of the HRB Africa Consortium
Ciara,
for 3 years. Yep.
Your time is up. Final point.
I'm just wrapping up with last few comments.
Thanks.
And there it was, as part of the HRB Africa Consortium, it was recognized community engagement is such a critical feature of the ethical conduct of research that all research projects had to commit to 5% of its funding to engagement. And the final point I would state on this is that while we are an Irish public, we are made up of different publics. And these different publics will need to be engaged, particularly those who have been historically subject to discrimination, stigmatization, or other forms of disenfranchisement. So to sum up and conclude, I would call on all of you who's involved in thinking about the ethics and governance and developing policy on this to be bold, learn from our past failings, but also look to other examples that have successfully integrated a participant-centric approach to this area of medicine.